Hi. Okay, so this video has been brought to you by pure procrastination, solely because this weekend was a little crazy and usually I film on the weekend and then it is Monday afternoon, so nothing like waiting until the last minute. Anyhow, today's video is going to be a little bit different. Well, thank God, right? Because my last two stories were super similar, but today's video is going to be a little bit different because this doesn't involve serial killers at all. This is kind of a spooky story, like a ghost story almost. However, there were lots of illegal activities, deaths, all sorts of stuff like that in this story. A little bit of backstory about how I thought of this. When I was about 14 or 15, maybe 16, 15 or 16, I was a little adventurous, to say the least. My friends and I would frequently go to abandoned places around the state of Indiana because that's where I live, and we would break into abandoned places and just kind of look around. We would take pictures and just see. One place, and this was my favorite place I ever went, and I don't even know why, but I still remember it pretty vividly. So why am I out of breath? So today we're going to talk about Central State Hospital, located in Indianapolis, in Indiana. It's actually not a mental hospital anymore. The city of Indianapolis actually bought it from the state, and now they have other plans for it. What is that? I don't know. I've heard 3 different things. So as of right now, I have no idea on what their plan is. They had bought it in like 2010, so we still don't know. However, when I went to Central State Hospital, there are 12 different buildings on the grounds on the campus, and we parked at an apartment complex a few blocks away. And you have to be very sneaky, so of course we dressed in all black, and which was like a super bad choice in and of itself. Super dangerous. I do not recommend it. Don't go there anymore because most of it's not even standing anymore. However, I went there twice. We wouldn't necessarily break in because most of the entrances were already open, so there was no breaking in necessary. I had Googled a map of it beforehand, and we had found out that there were tunnels underground, which we didn't know the first time. So we go and we start in the boiler powerhouse, I guess I want to say. We would start out there, and when we got there the second time, there was also a few other kids there that we didn't know, and we walked up there. They had flashlights shining down on us, and we were like, oh shit, like that's security. We would start running because obviously we didn't want to get in trouble, but they said like, hey, it's okay, it's just us. But anyway, they left shortly after that, and we decided to stay. It was rumored that there were dogs guarding the place, and we did hear barking the second time around when we came, but I don't ever recall seeing any dogs. So anyhow, we get to the boiler room. There's many different things that you can do. You can go up the stairs and get onto the roof, which was where the other kids were, or you could go to the tunnels and it would lead you around. So we did both. We took pictures on the roof, whatever teenagers do. So we go through the tunnels, and as we're walking, the air just feels very thick. Bailey. This man, you guys. Anyway, so we were in the tunnels and walking around and just kind of looking. We continue on, and as we're walking, there are other little rooms in these tunnels where it was rumored to have housed the patients in there, and there were apparently brackets on the walls, on the back walls, to secure the patient to that back wall so they couldn't escape their cell. I mean, just call it what it is. It was basically a prison for the mentally ill. As you're walking through, you see the rooms, but when you get to a certain point, you also see the incinerator. This is where I felt very heavy. And at this time, I hadn't experienced anything like it. I mean, I've always been pretty sensitive to energies around me, but I had no idea, like I do now, how sensitive I am. We were looking around the incinerator. There were still ashes in the incinerator, which were from what we assume were patients. So as we're walking through, we go to the men's building, the women's building, and we also went to the activity hall, which had a shop where you could like woodwork and stuff, and then up top it had previously been like a billiards room and bowling alley. When we went, the bowling alley was pretty much in shambles, and then the pool tables were no longer there. We did see all of that, which many of you know I love bowling, so that was really neat for me to see. There was no bowling equipment or anything, but it was neat to see the old lanes. As we're going through the men and women's buildings, we see the like nurse's station desk, and there is so much paperwork scattered about. There were x-rays, there were what I assume medical histories, what I assume were notes, what I assume were all the information of these poor patients. Needless to say, this was not only like one of the biggest thrills I had ever been through, it was super exciting, exhilarating, but at the same time, it teaches you a lot about yourself and how easy it is to pick up on this heavy energy. It was super dangerous, so nobody please don't break into places. It's not funny. You can get hurt. I mean, there were shards of glass. There were rumors to have trip traps where like if you open a door too far, it would set off an alarm, but we didn't experience any of that. But we were also very careful. We didn't attempt to open any doors that were shut. So enough about me. Let's go ahead and get into the facts about Central State Hospital. So Central State Hospital is located on Washington Street in Indianapolis, Indiana, and it was first announced that it was going to exist in 1827. However, the hospital was completed in 1848 and only had 5 patients at the time. The building was pretty small. It wasn't meant to house a lot of people, but as time went on, eventually about 2,500 to 3,000 patients were there at any given time. This is because no other counties had this equipment to care for the mentally ill at this time. In 1848, it opened as Indiana Hospital for the Insane, which now is super politically incorrect. I would never refer to anyone who is mentally ill as insane. So from 1848 to 1948, there had also been 2 castle-like buildings constructed for the patients to reside in as it got obviously too overpopulated. There were 2 buildings, and one was made for the males and one was made for the females, and it was known as the 7 steeple buildings. These were castle-like and very Victorian and very beautiful, really good craftsmanship just to keep the patients comfortable. There was a pathological department, or like a sick hospital, for patients who actually had physical ailments. There was also a farm colony outside of those buildings for the patients to farm on and learn new skills. Eventually, there was also an auditorium. Like I said before, there was bowling alleys, and there were billiards rooms, and there was obviously a woodworking shop. There was a church, and there was even a bakery, which is pretty neat. And then all of this was manned by the patients. There was also a firehouse at this time, a fire department, which was also manned by the patients, which I think is super neat. In the 1970s, the 7 steeples was torn down because it had become inhabitable. You see, Indiana is very, very good at spending lots of money on unimportant items. So it's needless to say that the psychiatric hospital was put on the back burner, and they didn't get the necessary repairs made. So, you know, leaky roofs, squeaky boards on the floor, maintenance, things that need to be tended to. After the 7 steeples was torn down, there were more hospital-like settings built, and these were more like hospitals, more like industrial hospital settings. It is rumored, and now a proven fact since the hospital was sold to the city of Indianapolis, that there were hundreds of patients that had passed away in the psychiatric hospital. They were placed into the incinerator and buried in unmarked graves, which is disgusting because don't you think their families would want their ashes, their remains? Let's go ahead and get through the horror stories. horror stories, not horror stories. This is not that type of channel. Like I was saying before, there were certain stories that patients were housed in the basement, and these were the worst off patients that were very vocal, very violent, very out of sorts. A lot of barbaric procedures were done in the basement as well, like lobotomies and electric shock therapy. It has been stated that the patients that were placed in the psychiatric hospital, some of them obviously needed help and others only had minor depression and anxiety. And a couple of patients that were enrolled in this hospital, their reason for enrollment was excessive masturbation. So the people in the early 1900s would hate to see us now in 2022, needless to say. I didn't get a drink. I was parched. As I mentioned before, they did perform barbaric procedures, one of them being electric shock therapy, which they would place almost like a head unit here, and they would shock the patient. This would cause them to go into very violent seizures, so there had to be many nurses in addition to the doctor to hold the patients down because they would break bones and also break hospital equipment. This seizure they went into would have temporary effects alleviating minor depression, but were not helpful in any type of major psychosis. The electric shock therapy was also performed with no anesthesia. Freaking nuts. Insulin therapy was also a thing too. They would inject the patient with like crazy amounts of insulin. This would cause them to go into a coma, and somehow the lack of certain chemicals and the rush of other chemicals was supposed to be beneficial to the brain. Obviously, this isn't a real thing, so it was done away with very, very soon after, but a lot of patients from this hospital actually ended up dying from this. Lobotomies were also performed. This has been rumored that some patients that were more well-behaved did get anesthesia, and patients that were more off the chain, they did not get anesthesia. A lot of abuse was going on in the psychiatric hospital, both in the basement and in the main floors. There was a lot of physical beatings from staff members, starvation, being locked in a cell 24 hours a day, verbally abused, not given food, not given water, not given any time to go to the restroom, stretch their legs, nothing like that. Once the public was like more aware of this abuse going on, they had demanded more humane ways of going about treatment, thus bringing in more, medications and more humane restraints, and also a lot more freedom and more of like a rehabilitation type of environment, in addition to all of the extracurriculars that the patients could do, but also they would be allowed out and about walking. There were, social interactions, and obviously, humans are pack animals essentially. We don't do well alone, we do best with multiples. Even though the policies had changed in the hospital, the abuse did not. There were still super mean and violent employees, unfortunately. So not a whole lot was done. So let's just go over all of the hauntings. This is employee stories and also people who were doing paranormal investigations, all of their accounts. And so we'll just go on right through it by building. And in the old powerhouse basement, maintenance would go down to the basement and shovel out the ashes of the patients twice a night. The screaming of a woman would be heard in the basement by multiple workers, and when this was brought up by one of the workers, several other workers had stated that they also experienced the same thing, so this wasn't just one person. The shadows of entities were seen going from cement post to cement post in the basement. An employee was taking a break down in the basement, and he ended up dozing off to sleep. And a few minutes later, he felt the presence of a dark demonic energy, and he felt hands around his neck. He was not even able to breathe. So obviously he, fought it off. And when he turned on the light switch, no one was to be found. And there were also like super deep red marks and also claw marks on his neck. And obviously he didn't do that to himself. The coal conveyor belt in the building would also just randomly turn on and off, and no one would be doing that. And I feel like back in the 1900s, the switches for things were probably a lot harder to push and pull, so I feel like it would be a lot harder to do that. So something funky was definitely going on there. So in the pathology building, the bodies of the deceased patients would obviously be examined to see if there were any synchronicities between patient to patient, like with the similar mental illness, to see if there was some type of testing that they could do when the patient was alive to see if they had that certain illness. Obviously, there really wasn't much found from that, but they would definitely hear noises when no one was down there with them. They would hear screaming, they would hear moaning, and they would also hear scratching at the walls. The administration building was stated by workers that they would hear running footsteps, and these were very, very loud footsteps. They would run across the hall into the front desk room, and then they would run off and no one would be there. And this was with the lights on, bright lights, just any time of day. So in the dormitories, which was the place of the most abuse, there were many accounts of women walking around in their bathrobes. Obviously, they weren't really there. They would be heard screaming and running up and down hallways. There would be door slamming. There would be screeches, and they would also hear weird scratching noises on the walls constantly. There would also be accounts of people who were outside the dorms at night, like, you know, walking to their car or getting off work, something like that. They would be outside and they would hear under this tree. One patient killed another patient, and the employees stated that when they walked by this tree, they heard the patient screaming and the other patient attacking them. So this is my absolute favorite story of this whole thing, because these things don't just happen. These are not coincidences. So this is the story of Alvin. Alvin was a patient at Central State Hospital, and he somehow, some way, either escaped or just vanished into thin air. Nobody knew where he was. No one could find him. They looked for him for weeks. It was nuts. So a few years later, there was a young female patient under the age of 18. She was walking around one day when she had first got there and ended up sitting off to the side in a random hallway and would just sit there and talk to the wall. She would do this for months. So an employee obviously just went over to her and was like, well, what are you doing? And she was like, I'm just talking to my friend, which I'm sure was super common at this time. Like in a psychiatric hospital, I'm sure these people had conversations with their friends that, you know, may not be there to us, but they are there to them. Anyway, she would say that she was just talking to her friend. They talked a lot. He was really nice, you know, just making casual conversation. And so the employee said, oh, really? You know, is it a boy? And she was like, yeah, it's a boy. And the worker was like, okay, well, what's his name? And she said, Alvin. And the worker was like, okay. So she got kind of spooked. So she went and reported this, and a new investigation was created to go find Alvin. And imagine their surprise when they found Alvin in the crawl space directly underneath where this girl would sit and talk to him. His body was so badly decayed they almost weren't even able to recognize him, to identify him. This is freaking wild. So how would you even know that? How would you know to sit there and talk to? You're not going to convince me otherwise. This girl knew what she was doing. She knew, she heard him. He was talking to her. Wild. So this just goes to show, like, were some of these people even insane? I don't believe so. I don't think so, because excessive masturbation is not a reason to go into a psychiatric hospital, in my opinion. These people probably just had, you know, depression or anxiety, or maybe even like mild forms of schizophrenia. So I don't even know. In the end, the hospital was shut down, and luckily there were other hospitals in surrounding counties, and they also came out with a new protocol to where they let patients who were somewhat self-sufficient. Jeez. English, Jeani. English. Thank you so much. Mostly self-sufficient patients would be released back out into the general public, and they would just be seen with medications and, you know, psychotherapies, stuff like that. So this kind of turned into what it is today now, where people who have mental health issues aren't really institutionalized indefinitely right away. Most people can just deal with it with therapy and healthy coping mechanisms, and also taking medication. And it just goes to show how far the mentally ill stereotype, I want to say the mentally ill stereotype came around full circle, to where it's almost normal to be on an antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication. So thank goodness for that though. I mean, this isn't any different than diabetes, something like that. Most of these conditions can be obviously treated outpatient. So they did the outpatient program. They shut down this hospital in 1994 because of the severe abuse. Like, things just weren't progressing and going as per policy, I guess. So they closed it down in 1994, and luckily there were more mental hospitals. I'm filming during the day, can you tell? There were more mental hospitals in other surrounding counties, so a lot of patients were transported through there, and others were a part of the outpatient program. So it's safe to say that there was a lot of naughty going on these grounds. There were so many unmarked graves which were discovered in some construction that was going on a few years back, that the city has decided to make a public statement saying that they will not be disturbing these unmarked graves. Okay, well, first of all, how do you know that there's unmarked graves if you didn't disturb them? Secondly, what are you going to do? Just build on top of them? I mean, have we not watched the movie Poltergeist? So, I don't know. I've heard that it's going to be a new police station, and I've also heard that it's going to be apartment buildings, so I guess we'll see in the next few years. Hopefully they either make a move or just restore it and let it be what it is. I mean, God, these people have suffered so much already. Like, they're already still there looking for a way out, looking to go home, essentially. Okay, you guys, tell me your thoughts on this. Did we like a non-serial killer story? I don't know. It was just near and dear to my heart, so I figured, why not? Tune in for next week and let me know who you want me to talk about next. And that's all I can think of. Bye. Okay, P.S. We need a name for her. Or him. I'm not assuming their gender. Come up with some names for me so we can name. Toodaloo.